Hello, everyone, and welcome to part 5 of our read aloud of Call It Courage. Boy, when we left off on part 4, Mafatu discovered something not so great about his island, didn't he? As he was exploring the opposite side of the island from where his canoe crashed, and he is starting to try and at least survive, he discovered a clearing where he found a sacred place belonging to a cannibal tribe. Now remember, they don't live on this island. They probably live on that other island that he saw in the distance across in the ocean. But he knows this is a place that they come. And when we left off, he had just entered and seen that statue and thought to himself, uh-oh. Mafatu stood rooted, unable to advance, powerless to flee. Uri slunk at his side, growling low, the hair on his neck lifting stiffly. Involuntarily, the boy looked up. Through an opening in the trees, the cloud cone of Smoking Island floated on a wine-colored sea. Could that distant island be the home of the savages who used this Motu Tabu for their place of sacrifice? Was it here that they came in their black canoes to turn the night hideous with their drums and ceremonies and leaping fires? Mafatu shivered. He had believed that Maui, god of the fishermen, had led him safe to this island. But perhaps after all it had been only a cruel prank of Moana the sea god, angry at having been cheated once again. The boy seemed to hear the voice of Moana saying, "Someday, Mafatu. Someday, I will claim you." It was evident that the savages had been here recently, for the piles of ashes rested undisturbed by wind and storm. The cleared circle seemed to hold its breath, locked in a supernatural silence. As the boy paused, irresolute and unsure, looking up at the towering marae, his eye was caught and held by a gleam of light, and his heart gave a mighty leap, for he saw that a spearhead lay on their sacred platform. Finely ground, sharp-edged, a spear for food, a weapon against attack. Dare he take it? It might mean death. His heart pounded. He moved 1 foot forward. His hands were damp and cold. The flashing spearhead winked back at him like an evil eye. The boy's limbs turned to water. For a second he was powerless to move. In that moment, had a score of black men leapt forth from the jungle, he could not have stirred or cried. He fought himself for control. Taking a deep breath, he whispered, "It is you, Maui, who have led me to this island. I know it. Do not forsake me now." Almost it seemed as if he could see dark shadows moving among the ferns and hear the phantom whisper of voices. But he edged forward, poised for instant flight. There. He was so close to the idol he could have touched it. He reached out his hand. It took every ounce of will. The spearhead glistened brightly. His fingers closed about it and tightened. The towering idol cast a shadow of darkness across the green earth. Quickly the boy drew the spearhead toward him, but in moving it, he dislodged a bone. It fell at his feet. Its touch was deathly cold. Mafatu gasped. Then he whipped about and was running as quickly as his feet would carry him, but still he gripped the spearhead in his fist. He scrambled back up the path from whence he had come. His heart was hammering, his legs stiff and sore. The twisted roots of the mape trees reached for him as he fled. Never had they seemed so much like grasping fingers. The giant tree ferns turned the jungle to an eerie gloom. The boy was filled with unaccountable dread. His limbs seemed weighted. When at last he reached the base of the lava slide, he turned at right angles and fought his way upward, pulling himself by vines. At last he regained his position on the plateau. He drew up breathless and panting, but the spearhead flashed in his hand. He looked down at it in wonder. Nothing had happened to him. He had touched the marae, dislodged a bone on the place taboo, yet still he lived. The sun shone, the sky still arced blue. Nothing was changed. And the spear, aye, but it was a beautiful one. It was worth all the risk. Those eaters of men had wrought it well. Now he, Mafatu, could kill the wild pig. Now he, Mafatu, could defend himself against attack. But most important of all, he knew that he had won a great victory over himself. He had forced himself to do something that he dreaded, something that took every ounce of his will. The taste of victory salted his lips. He threw out his chest and cried, "It is you, Maui, who have helped me. My thanks to you." Uri leapt and pranced with excitement at his master's side. Back once more at his own shelter, Mafatu kept looking and looking at the spear. Happiness flooded through him in warm tides. It was not so much the possession of a spear, no. It was the fact that he had touched them array. That took courage. Aye, courage. And as he set about searching for a fire stick, he sang a song at the top of his young lungs. It was a brave song of Taroa, the hero god who rose out of the sea to slay the enemies of his people. Mafatu's voice rose clear and strong across the jungle stillness. Seabirds and parakeets hushed their cries to listen to the strange intruding sound. At last Mafatu found a fire stick to his liking, a piece of hard wood, bone dry, and as large around as his forearm. Then he searched for a smaller piece of the same wood. Propping the larger against a rock, he squatted on his haunches before it and gripped the smaller piece in both hands. He began to move it back and forth upon the hard surface, and a groove commenced to form. A little pile of wood dust gathered at one extremity of the groove. Now the boy's hands were moving faster and faster. Back and forth they flew, while perspiration stood out on his forehead and his breath came in gasps. At last he was rewarded. A wisp of smoke drifted upward from the wood dust. A brief glow. The boy seized a few twigs and, cupping his hands with great care, blew upon the spark. A flame burst into life. He had made fire. Weary with the exertion, Mafatu settled back on his haunches and watched the leaping flame. Fire! His arms and back ached unmercifully, and the wound in his leg throbbed. But the warm glow of flame comforted him. It made him think of home, of food and warmth and companionship, of faces around the evening circle, of the drone of old men's voices telling their endless tales of daring. And he was swept by a sudden wave of loneliness, a longing for the sound of his father's deep voice. He shut his lips tight and fought it back, then leapt to his feet and set about his small tasks with a great show of business. He would not think of those things. He would not remember if he could help it. Now he would have cooked food, warmth when he was wet through, and the first implement with which to set about building his canoe. Tomorrow he would fell a tree by fire and start to work upon his dugout. He would make fire only by day, and even then not too large a blaze, for its glow might be visible on the distant island of the Eaters of Men. Thus he forced his thoughts into safer channels. He threw some breadfruit into the fire. There it would stay until it was charred black and thoroughly cooked. Next he laid 6 fei, wild bananas, in the coals, covering them with wet leaves so that they would slowly steam through. While his dinner was cooking, he had yet another task to do, and he set about it at once. He tore off 6 fronds of a low-growing coconut tree, then began to plait them into flat, mat-like screens. These, made into a lean-to, would be his shelter against wind and storm. Several layers of them would become watertight. "Oh, if only I had my knife, Uri," the boy groaned. "How simple it would be! I must search the lagoon for a pahua shell. It grinds down to a fine cutting edge, and we'll soon have a good knife." Uri thought so too. That was evident from the motion of his tireless tail. "Perhaps," Mafatu thought suddenly, "I might find a knife at the sacred place of the Eaters of Men." But then he shook his head. No, I shall never return to that terrible Mare taboo. But each day, he resolved, he would climb to the high plateau, his lookout to the southwest. Someday the Eaters of Men would come back, perhaps before long. Mafatu was certain of it, as he was certain that the sun shone and was warm. It was inevitable. And when the dark men came, he would have to be prepared to leave, or he would die. The boy looked fondly at the tamanu tree that he had marked already for his canoe. "Tomorrow I shall start work upon it," he promised, "and what a canoe I shall build! Deep and strong, but light. An outrigger as swift and powerful as a shark's tail. And when my father sees it, he will say, 'Aye, my son, but they build fine canoes in that island you have come from.' And then I will say, 'But I built it myself, my father.' And then he will say, 'Aye, is it possible, this fine canoe?'" The fire blazed brightly, and the breadfruit gave forth a tempting odor. Jets of vapor rose from the steaming bananas. Uri snuggled down at his master's side, and Mafatu hugged the dog close. "Aye, there's food for you too, my brother," Mafatu said. "And tomorrow we shall have fish. See my spear, how bravely it flashes? I will make a new shaft for it, and then I shall kill the ma'o, the shark, and the wild pig too. Aye, Uri, you'll see." The boy pulled the breadfruit from the fire and broke it in half. Its white, flaky meat was packed with sustenance. a little like bread in taste, a trifle like potato in texture, but better than either. The boy gave half of it to Uri. The dog circled around, sniffing longingly as he waited for his dinner to cool. The bananas popped from their skins while their juices bubbled in the heat. Deftly, Mafatu slid them out of the fire and transferred them to a broad leaf that served as a plate. Then, unmindful of burned fingers, he fell upon the hot food. He was famished. It seemed that he had never been so hungry in his whole life. And for a time, there was only the sound of his greedy munching. Never had food tasted so good. He ate and ate until his stomach could hold no more. Then a great weariness stole through his limbs. With a sigh of deep content, he sank back upon the cool sand and closed his eyes. Uri snuggled close, warm and friendly against his side. Overhead, the plaited fronds of the palms formed a snug shelter. "Someday," the boy thought drowsily, "I'll make my roof watertight, but not yet." The tide was running out of the lagoon with the sunset in a whispering hum of sound, like the reassuring hush of a mother to her child. Mafatu lay there under his lean-to, relaxed in every nerve. He had fire, he had food, he had shelter. He had faced Moana the sea god. He had dared the sacred marae of the Eaters of Men to win his spear. There was a newfound confidence singing in his heart. He had found a new belief in himself. And at peace with himself and his world, he slept. The very next morning, Mafatu set about building his canoe. He had banked his fire the night before in the natural shelter of a cave, and he resolved never to let the sparks die out, for it was altogether too difficult to make fire with the fire stick, and it required too much time. In Hikaru, for that reason, the fires were always kept burning, and it was the special charge of the younger members of a family to see that fuel was ever at hand. Woe unto the small boy who let the family fires go out. While Mafatu's breakfast roasted in the coals, the boy cleared the brush away from the base of a great tamanu tree. There was no wood better for canoe building than this. It was tough, durable, yet buoyant in the water. Mafatu could fell his tree by fire and burn it out too. Later, he would grind an adze out of basalt for the finishing work. The adze would take a long time, but he had made them often in Hikaru, and he knew just how to go about it. The boy was beginning to realize that the hours he had spent fashioning utensils were to stand him now in good stead. Nets and knives and shark line, implements and shell fish hooks, he knew how to make them all. How he had hated those tasks in Hikaru, but now he was quick and clever with his hands, and he was grateful for the skill which was his. The fire crackled and snapped about the base of the tamanu tree. When at length it had eaten well into the trunk, Mafatu climbed aloft and crept cautiously out to a large branch that overhung the beach. Then, taking firm hold of the branches above his head, he began to jump up and down. As the fire ate deeper into the trunk, the tree began to lean under the boy's weight. With a snap and a crash, it fell across the sand. As it fell, Mafatu leapt free of the branches just as nimbly as a cat. "I think that's enough for today, Uri," he decided. "Tomorrow we'll build our fires down the trunk and start burning it out. When the Eaters of Men come, we will be ready." In the meantime, there were many other things to do. A fish trap of bamboo, a net of sennet vine, a fish hook too. If only he could find some bone. And while the canoe was building, how could Mafatu get out to the distant reef to set his trap unless first he made a raft of bamboo? The boy decided that the raft was of first importance. He chose a score or more of fine bamboo as large around as his arm, felling them by fire. Then he lashed them together with strips of purao bark, making a sturdy raft of 2 thicknesses. It would serve him well until his canoe would be finished. As he worked, his mind returned again and again to the wild pig he was determined to kill. How could he go back to Hikaru without a boar's tooth necklace? Why, that necklace was almost as important as the canoe itself. For by that token, men would know his strength and courage. When the day came that he should leave this high island, he would sail to the north and to the east. Somewhere in that quarter lay the cloud of islands, the great Tuamotu archipelago, which extends across 1,000 miles of ocean and 10 degrees of latitude. Within those reef-spiked channels floated Hikaru, his homeland. There was no doubt in his mind that he would find it, for Maui, who had led him safe to this shore, would someday guide him home again. But first Mafatu knew he must prove himself worthy. Men should never again call him Mafatu, the boy who was afraid. And Tavana Nui should say with pride, "Here is my son, come home from the sea. Kiwi the albatross came and went on his mysterious errands, emerging out of the blue space and vanishing into it again. At sundown regularly, the white bird came wheeling and circling to land clumsily on the beach almost at Mafatu's side, while Uri pranced about and greeted his friend after his own fashion. And as for Uri, well, he was having the time of his life, for there were countless seabirds nesting along the shore to be chased and put to rout, and wild goats and pigs in the mountains to make life exciting enough for any dog. Mafatu had discovered a mulberry tree. He stripped off the bark and removed the inner white lining. He wet the fiber, laid it upon a flat stone, and set about beating it with a stick of wood. The fiber spread and grew thinner under the persistent beating. The boy added another strip, wet it, and beat it into the first one, and then another layer and another. Soon he had a yard of primitive cloth to serve as paro wrapped around his waist. It was soft and white, and now at last he was properly clothed. "Before I go home, I will make a dye of ava and paint a fine design on my paro," the boy promised himself. "I must not go back ill-clothed and empty-handed. Men must know that I have conquered the sea and made the land serve me as well." The days continued to pass in a multitude of tasks that kept Mafatu busy from dawn till dark. His lean-to grew into a 3-sided house with bamboo walls and a thatch of palm leaves. The 4th wall was open to the breezes of the lagoon. It was a trim little house, but he was proud of it. A roll of woven mats lay on the floor. There was a shelf in the wall with 3 bowls cut from coconut shells. Bone fish hooks dangled from a peg. There was a coil of tough sinnet rope many feet long. An extra paro of tapa waterproofed with the gum of the artu tree for wet weather. All day long the wind played through the openings in the bamboo walls, and at night lizards scurried through the thatch with soft rustlings. One morning, wandering far down the beach, Mafatu came upon a sheltered cove, and his heart gave a great leap of joy, for there, white gleaming in the sun, was all that remained of the skeleton of a whale. It might not have meant very much to you or to me, but to Mafatu it meant knives and fishhooks galore, splintered bone for darts and spears, a shoulder blade for an axe. It was a veritable treasure trove. The boy leapt up and down in his excitement. "Uri!" he shouted. "We're rich! Come, help me drag these bones home." His hands seemed all thumbs in his eagerness. He tied as many bones as he could manage into 2 bundles. One bundle he shouldered himself, the other Uri dragged behind him, and thus they returned to the campsite, weary, but filled with elation. Even the dog seemed to have some understanding of what this discovery meant, or if not, he was at least infected with his master's high spirits. He leapt about like a sportive puppy, yapping until he was nearly hoarse. Now began the long process of grinding the knife and the axe. Hour after hour, squatting before a slab of basalt rock, Mafatu worked and worked until his hands were raw and blistered and the sweat ran down into his eyes. The knife emerged first, since that was the most imperative. Its blade was 10 inches long, its handle a knob from a joint. It was sharp enough to cut the fronds of coconut trees, to slice off the end of a green nut. Aye, but it was a splendid knife. All Mafatu's skill went into it. It would be a fine weapon as well, the boy thought grimly as he ground it down to a sharp point. Some sea robber had been breaking into his bamboo trap, and he was going to find out who the culprit was. Probably that old hammerhead shark who was always cruising around, just as if he owned the lagoon. Fishing with a line took too long when you were working against time. Mafatu could not afford to have his trap robbed. Twice it had been broken into, the stout bamboo crushed and the contents eaten. It was the work either of a shark or of an octopus, that was for certain. No other fish would have been strong enough to snap the tough bamboo. Mafatu's mouth was set in a grim line as he worked away on his knife. It must be that old hammerhead. Undoubtedly, he was the thief. Mafatu had come to recognize him, for every day when the boy went out with his trap, that shark, larger than all the others, would circle around, wary and watchful. The other sharks seemed to treat the hammerhead with deference. Hunger alone drove Mafatu out to the reef to set his trap. He knew that if he was to maintain strength to accomplish all that lay ahead, he must have fish to add to his diet of fruit. But often as he set his trap far out by the barrier reef, the hammerhead would approach, roll over slightly in passing, and the cold gleam of its eye filled Mafatu with dread and with anger. "Just wait, you!" the boy threatened darkly, shaking his fist at the Mao. "Wait until I have my knife. You will not be so brave then, Mao. You will run away when you see it flash." But the morning that the knife was finished, Mafatu did not feel so brave as he would have liked. He hoped he would never see the hammerhead again. Paddling out to the distant reef, he glanced down from time to time at the long-bladed knife where it hung about his neck by a cord of sinnet. It wasn't, after all, such a formidable weapon. It was only a knife made by a boy from a whale's rib. Uri sat on the edge of the raft, sniffing at the wind. Mafatu always took the dog along, for Uri howled unmercifully if he were left behind. And Mafatu had come to rely upon the companionship of the little yellow dog. The boy talked with the animal as if he were another person, consulting with him, arguing, playing when there was time for play. They were very close, these two. This morning, as they approached the spot where the fish trap was anchored, Mafatu saw the polished dorsal fin of the hated hammerhead circling slowly in the water. It was like a triangle of black basalt making a little furrow in the water as it passed. "Hi, Mo," the boy shouted roughly, trying to bolster up his courage. "I have my knife today. See? Coward who robs traps. Catch your own fish." The hammerhead approached the raft in leisurely fashion. It rolled over slightly, and its gaping jaws seemed to curve in a yawning grin. Uri ran to the edge of the raft, barking furiously. The hair on the dog's neck stood up in a bristling ridge. The shark, unconcerned, slowly moved away. But then with a whip of its powerful tail, it rushed at the bamboo fish trap and seized it in its jaws. Mafatu was struck dumb. The hammerhead shook the trap as a terrier might shake a rat. The boy watched, fascinated, unable to make a move. He saw the muscles work in the fish's neck as the great tail thrashed the water to fury. The trap splintered into bits, while the fish within escaped, only to vanish into the shark's mouth. Mafatu was filled with impotent rage. The hours he had spent making that trap. But all he could do was shout threats at his enemy. Uri was running from one side of the raft to the other, furious with excitement. At that moment, a large wave sheeted across the reef. At that same second, the dog's shift in weight tipped the raft at a perilous angle. With a helpless yelp, Uri slid off into the water. Mafatu sprang to catch him, but he was too late. Instantly, the hammerhead whipped about as the wave pushed Mafatu and the raft further away from Uri. And I hope you don't hate me too much, but that is where we are going to stop. Whew. If you were worried about Uri when Mafatu crashed on the island, you're going to be doubly concerned now. Just to kind of create that mental picture of what's happening in that final scene of today's passage, Mafatu and his raft are being pushed away by a wave as Uri has fallen into the water out of reach as the hammerhead draws ever nearer. I hope you join us for the next part of Call It Courage so we can see what happens here.